Chapter 1. Nameless. The Prince of Ravens stood gazing out his room's large arched window at the distant horizon, when the clock struck the hour and the celebratory bells of his name day rang out once more across the city. It was late morning, an hour short of midday, and yet the entire city spread out before him was cloaked in shadow. Then again the city was always cloaked in shadow, for in the sky hung the dark, ever-present, billowing clouds that bore witness to the Empress's power. Today they were shot through with still darker threads that showed they were heavy with rain. Most of the city's people were indoors keeping dry, but the Prince of Ravens had always liked the rain. A wind sprang up and rushed in through the open doors of the balcony to ruffle the prince's black hair, blowing it off his forehead. His eyes, darker and blacker even than the clouds, stood out in sharp contrast to his pale white skin, which had only ever seen the cloaking shadows of the city and the closed interior of the fortress. His clothing completed the somber appearance. Robes dyed midnight black, the color of his office. The clouds he was watching stretched out almost across the entire sky, stopping just short of the far distant horizon. A slim, bright, tantalizing view of the world outside Lucien. There, barely visible, was a touch of green that he imagined to be trees, and the bright gleam of sunlight reflected off a blue splash of lake. They were no more than fleeting impressions, flashes of light and swirls of color, which somehow made it through the murky darkness of Lucien to the prince's window. As he'd done countless times before, he tried to estimate the distance. 20 leagues? 30? He knew how far a mile was, but had little practical experience with judging distances. The fortress was tall enough that one could see for miles in all directions unimpaired, but this vision hovered on the very edge of sight, the very edge of the Empress's immediate influence. It was far, however many miles away it was. "Someday," he said silently, trying to will the words to be true the way his brother Ricard had instructed him. "Someday I'll go there." The clouds were constant here. The will of the Empress made it so, and as such there was no other possibility. There had not been sunlight in the city of Lucien, nor the surrounding countryside in the prince's entire life. But he had read of the sun in books he wasn't supposed to know existed. Books that sat on dusty shelves in the deep bowels of the fortress. Part of him, the part that needed to see things for himself in order to believe them, felt that such a thing couldn't truly be. A giant ball of fire that hung in the sky? Ridiculous. There might not even be grass or trees or streams or anything of the sort, no matter what the book said. Maybe all that there was, the whole world over, was the bright metal of clockwork inventions and the dull gray-black of stone towers covered with the murky soup of industrial soot. That was all there was of his world, and all that would ever be. And yet, the light was there, on the horizon. Once he proved himself to Mother, she would let him leave the city. She had promised that she would, and when she did, he would see for himself. The skin on his back and shoulders grew warm, and he tensed. The outer door to his chambers opened, and a soft breeze entered the room. It was light enough that it did not stir his heavy black robes and should have gone unnoticed. Indeed, it would have, if anyone but the Prince of Ravens had been there. Quiet, stealthy movement, and then the door was shut once more. A sense of something dry and stale that reminded him of rustling scales and cold reptilian eyes bloomed in his mind, born of the new presence permeating the room. Beneath that sense was a boiling, sickly corruption, like the white fluid secreted from dying plants. His stomach churned, and he fought back the urge to be sick. The feeling passed as it always did, and he took a shallow breath in through his mouth. The interloper moved a step closer, stopped, and stood watching his back. He knew who it was. He always knew when one of the children was near. They left a much more profound imprint on the world than the commons and baseborn, and with the powers of the Raven talisman he could sense them immediately. He decided to let her speak first, though, and so remained stationary, staring out his balcony doors, feigning ignorance of her presence. "Hello, brother," said a soft and silky voice behind him. "Hello, sister," he said immediately, with a touch of boredom. He heard a rustling as she shifted in surprise, again sending images of dark scales and a sinuous form through his mind. All of his siblings were uneasy about how attuned to life he was. It was the only thing in which they could not best him. Not that it matters, he thought. As of yesterday, he had been confirmed as the lowest of them all. Still, his siblings hated anything that made him seem somehow better than them in the eyes of their mother, even if the difference was ultimately unimportant. "What is it you need?" he asked in a civil monotone. "Always staring out the window," Samantha, Prince of Snakes, said, ignoring his question. She was sending a message. She would come to the purpose of her visit when it pleased her. "Always looking. At what? What do you think you see out there, little brother? The city will never be yours. You are last in line, and always will be. So, what is it you look at?" He did not respond immediately. She wouldn't understand him even if he tried to explain. None of his siblings wished for anything but more power, for a way to control the area covered in darkness. None of them thought of the area outside Lucien, even though they lived there for the majority of the year in their respective principalities. Perhaps they had once. He liked to think that they had, particularly his brother Joffred. He wondered vaguely if someday he too would forget his dreams of the sun. "Nothing of importance," he sighed. "Lies," Samantha hissed. Without turning, the prince knew her talisman markings were glowing a sickly green, standing out along the sides of her long, graceful neck and over the backs of her hands as she sensed the half-truth he had spoken. His heart beat faster for a handful of seconds before he could calm it. He turned to face her. "I was thinking of the future, Samantha. Is that a crime?" She breathed in sharply through her wide, flat nose, and her eyes narrowed dangerously. It was a crime for any to speak the names of the children, and though such laws did not apply to the children themselves, such a thing was still discourteous. However, his answer was ambiguous enough to pass the snake's test, and though she pierced him with her pale green eyes, studying his face for even the smallest trace of untruth, she found nothing. His heart fluttered nervously again under her scrutiny, but he knew his sister's powers did not extend to mind-reading. The mind was impenetrable. Not even the Empress could break into a person's mind unless they allowed it. She could command them, force them to do her will, inflict pain on them until they willingly shared themselves with her, but she could not directly force her way into the thoughts of her subjects. Many feared she could, even the Most High, but the children knew otherwise. "No," his sister said in answer. "It is not a crime to think about the future, but it doesn't matter, because you're already in disfavor. So you can think about the future all you want, and it will come to naught." "Mother hasn't made a judgment yet," he said. "Yet Mother is displeased." "Truly, I hadn't noticed," he responded. "Do not play games with me," she hissed, as her temper, always banked, flared to life. "What have you done? I demand that you tell me." "You cannot demand anything of me," he said, careful to keep his tone even. "I may be the youngest and the least of the children, but you cannot command me. That is one lesson I know by heart." "I am over 50 years your senior," she responded, which was true, though she looked to be no more than 20 years of age. "You would be wise not to test me, little brother." "You think in all that time you'd have learned to control your temper," he responded, taking out his anxiety by goading her. Her cheeks bloomed with pink spots, and she seemed ready to spit at him. But instead of lashing out, she smiled, and he felt chills go down his back. Lesser men were known to cry and beg in gibbering madness when something caused Samantha to smile. But he was a prince, and he would not cringe when his sister threw a tantrum. "Soon you may very well be taking orders from me," she said. His skin began to prickle with anxiety. "What do you mean?" "Mother does not take away the names of her children lightly." "Do you have a message from Mother?" he asked, his mouth dry. "No," she said. "Then what—" "Do not interrupt me," she sneered. After a long, dramatic pause, she continued. "I am here to bear you a summons." The prince's heart stopped dead for a beat, and when it started again, his chest felt as though it were being squeezed in a vice. His palms became slick with sweat, and a roaring sounded in his ears. It took all his will to give no visible sign of his distress as Samantha crossed the room with her sinuous, hypnotizing walk and sat down at the large oak writing desk. A summons. The Empress did not summon her children. "What have you done, little brother?" hissed the snake. The irony of the situation was that he truly couldn't tell her. He had no knowledge of what he'd done. Exactly a week prior, an imperial decree had been issued unnaming him, a disgrace saved only for the lowest of the low. When he had arrived at the imperial chambers, overcome with guilt and shame, to ask what he had done to deserve such punishment, he had been turned away. He, one of the children of the Empress. And now a summons. Shadows and light, what had he done to deserve this? What had he done? Through the haze of his shock, he noticed that Samantha was sitting in the carved wooden chair behind his desk. His room was sparsely furnished, something that set him apart from his siblings. But what he did have was meaningful to him, and something inside his chest grew hot and angry at the thought of Samantha touching any of it. He walked over to the writing desk, managing to keep his face expressionless as he did. He could feel his lips trying to twitch in disgust as he looked at her sprawled in his chair, but he wouldn't let them. If he showed her what he was feeling, she would have a way in. If he gave her nothing more than the twitch of one eyebrow, she would be able to read him like a book. "For you, dear brother," she said, holding out a parchment scroll. Her hand was covered in green veins, and the skin looked almost as if it were molting. The prince reached out, keeping his face emotionless, and took the scroll. In a flash of movement, the Prince of Snakes lunged. He knew it was coming, but the action still almost made him empty his stomach. The sense of corruption and bile was amplified tenfold as Samantha grabbed his wrist and the green lines on her hand pulsed with a sickly light. But his only outward response was to calmly look into his sister's face. For a moment, the beautiful, seductive mask she wore was replaced by a look of gleeful triumph. But just as quickly the look disappeared and was replaced with confusion, and her eyes jerked down to the prince's hand. The talisman of snakes required one of two things: signs of emotion or physical contact. A person could stifle their emotions to the point where they wouldn't show on their face, but it was impossible to suppress all physical signs completely. Through touch, Samantha could do what she couldn't through sight alone. The Prince of Ravens didn't know how it worked, and he doubted he ever would. But he knew that if Samantha touched his skin, she would know exactly what he was feeling, and he would be in her power. But currently, his hands were covered by thick leather gloves to protect against the cold of the open balcony doors. For a moment, Samantha stared dumbly at his hands, and then she let out a snarl and ripped her own hands back, leaving the piece of parchment clutched in his fist. "I apologize," the prince said, with the barest hint of a smile, one that he knew she would catch but not be able to use against him. "It's a bit chilly in here. The next time you wish to hold hands as loving siblings, I'll be sure to keep the doors closed." Samantha stood stock still, completely at a loss for words, though quite clearly full of wrath at being outwitted. And then, quite abruptly, she spun on her heel and stalked out of the room, all the time seeming to slither, her body undulating with each step. The door closed behind her with a sharp snap. The prince dropped his icy composure and let out a ragged breath as he clutched at the writing desk. His heart was racing as he looked down at the thin cylinder of parchment clutched in his hand. It was sealed with the imperial emblem of the diamond crowned over two crossed trilobies. He broke the wax, hands shaking, and read, "You are summoned into the presence of the Empress of the Diamond Throne, ruler of Lucia, mother of the children of the 7 principalities, possessor of the light, the fearful shadow, the grace of gods and men, to discuss your inheritance." The message was signed by the hand of the Empress, a short, small, ferrety man who carried out the Empress's commands. His inheritance. But that meant... He turned to look out the balcony doors so quickly he cricked his neck. He stumbled forward, breath coming in short, surging pants. The balcony looked out toward the south, toward the 7th principality. Each of the children ruled a separate part of the empire, which as a whole consisted of 7 provinces that had once been nothing more than uncharted territory inhabited by savages. When the Empress had arrived from across the ocean, she had expanded her territory 1 province at a time, using fire and sword. The original inhabitants were quickly dealt with, and those that foolishly chose to fight instead of accepting the Empress as their rightful ruler and the embodiment of the gods were killed. For nearly 1,000 years the rule of the Empress had brought peace to the provinces, all but the seventh, which was the final resistant stronghold of those who called themselves the exiled kindred. When the Empress had crossed the sea, she had brought with her 7 talismans of power. She had kept them with her during her fight against the kindred, but a time came when the rebels infiltrated her government, sowing the seeds of unrest and dissent across the land. The provinces began to suffer riot, famine, and plague spread by the exiled kindred. And so, 500 years after her rule began, the Empress bore a son, the first son of the Empress, Prince Ricard, who inherited the most powerful of the talismans, making him the Prince of Lions. Wherever he went, he turned people to the cause of the Empire, shining like a bright light in the eyes of the lost, a safe harbor for those who had been unsure which side to choose. He drove the rebels from the Empire and then took up residence in Tyne, the most prosperous of the provinces, and was named Lord Commander of the armies of the Empire. Each of the children born and claimed thereafter was given one of the talismans. Many children were born, but only 6 more, the Prince of Ravens included, had been claimed as true children of the Empress, embodying those virtues that she found most important. Each child, at a certain point in their life, was given a task to complete, to show their mother they were ready to rule alongside her. This task, and the rewards that came from it, was called their inheritance. It was well and widely known that the Prince of Ravens' inheritance was the 7th Principality, the province furthest to the south, and that his task would be to wipe out the remainder of the exiled kindred for the glory of the Empire. Was this why Mother had been so harsh? To prepare him to receive his inheritance? Perhaps I will see sunlight sooner than I'd hoped.